In this chapter, we'll be covering Introductory to Greek Grammar, Stevens's Greek Primer, chapter 13, which begins on page 191. So I encourage you to take your book out, turn to page 191, follow along in your textbooks. I'll be referring to several things in the book there as we go along. So in chapter 13, let me just review a little bit to help you understand what's going to be happening in the textbook starting in chapter 13. So up to this point in studying Greek in chapters 1 through 12, you have been introduced to everything from, and now here I'll kind of go in order as I recall it, the letters, the Greek alphabet, the accent marks, the punctuation. You were introduced in chapters 2 and 3 to the present tense verbs. You introduced the verb, at least one of the tenses of the verb system. Then you dove into nouns, and you learned the three declensions of nouns. You learned the article, adjectives, adverbs, the number system in Greek. By the time, and prepositions as well. By the time you get to chapter 13, you have learned all of that. Everything there is to learn about the noun system, the article, the adverb, adjective system. You've been introduced to the verb system. But when you've learned everything there is to know about all that stuff, once you hit chapter 13 in Stevens's Greek grammar here, from this point out, it's pretty much all about, not entirely, you're going to have conditional sentences in the next chapter, but it's pretty much all about the verb system from this point out. Now, you've been introduced to the verb system in chapter 2 and 3, the present tense, but the rest of the book is going to be diving into the rest of the verb system. It's probably it's got, of all the aspects of the Greek language, it's got the most moving parts. It's got the most detail to it. So the verb system from this point out. Now, just to help you understand, recap chapter 2 and 3 and help you understand what's going down in chapter 13 and the rest of the book, I want to recap the parameters of a Greek verb. Remember, if you're asked to locate a Greek verb on an exam or in an exercise in your workbook, in one of your chapter exercises, remember that the Greek verb has 5 parameters, okay? A sixth if you count the lexical form and the translation. We don't think about those as parameters, but if you're asked to locate, you should have 7 things. Now, what are the 5 parameters of a verb? Think back to chapter 2 and 3. If you give the verb luo, for example, you have the tense, the voice, the mood, you have the person and the number, right? So tense, you've only learned one tense up to this point, present tense. The voice, you've learned that there are 3 voices to the Greek language, active, middle, and passive. The mood, you've only learned one mood, indicative, and mood communicates the level contingency of the verb. We haven't gotten completely into that. We'll talk more about that later in a later chapter. Then you got person and number, first, second, third, singular or plural. These are the 5 parameters of the verb system. So that first parameter is tense, and you've only learned one again. That's present. Well, in chapter 13, you're going to learn a new tense, another tense. It's called the imperfect tense. In fact, you're going to find out as we go through the next several chapters, there are even more tenses than that. There's the aorist, the perfect, the pluperfect tense, the future tense. There's a number of tenses. And with each of these tenses, they have different ways that they form the verb. So, in chapter 13, chapter 13 is all about the imperfect tense. Now, unlike chapter 11, I really think that this chapter is not nearly as difficult. It doesn't have nearly as much things. You are going to have to learn a new set of ending paradigms, some new vocabulary, of course, with every chapter. But by and large, it's not a heavy loaded with new information, though it does have some new things to it. So let's dive into it. On page 191. He's going to talk about and just have a little bit of review about verbs. Remember, Greek verbs, just review, have 2 main aspects to them, okay? By the way, all verbs too, even in other languages, English does as well. We just don't think of the 2 aspects a whole lot. But 2 aspects when we think about Greek verbs, time of action and kind of action, okay? These are the 2 major parameters that a tense communicates. So when you talk about a tense in the Greek verb, it has 2 aspects or parameters, we might say. It has kind of action, time of action. Remember, time of action we're familiar with as English speakers. We tend to think of verbs mostly in time of action. We want to know when did it happen, past, present, or future. He ran, he is running, he will run, past, present, and future. But remember, you were introduced in chapter 2 to 3 in the Greek verb tense. If you're thinking like a Greek, you're not so much asking when did that action happen. You're primarily asking what kind of action do we have here? And you learn with the present tense, present is durative ongoing. What is so imperfect tense? What is the kind of action with imperfect tense? That's what he talks about on page 191 at the very bottom. Imperfect tense is durative action, just like the present tense, ongoing. What makes it different than the present tense then? It's time of action. Okay, so present tense was ongoing durative action in present time. And we say we had a verb like go, we would translate it I go. That could be a present tense translation. Or to bring out that durative ongoing action, we'd say I am going. Remember, we add that helping verb, be verb, and then we turn it into a participle. I am going. Well, here's how you translate an imperfect tense verb. You would just throw it into the past. I was going. He was eating would be imperfect. Notice it's got the durative action, but not in the present. It's in the past, right? By using the word was. I was going. I was eating. That would be imperfect tense. So imperfect is durative action in the past time. Okay, that's what the perfect tense is all about. And he's just reviewing that stuff there on page 191. Now flip to page 192 and look at table 13.1. This is really, really important. And he introduces you to this concept at this point because now we're going to be diving deep into the verb system. And this is a little tool, this little chart is a really helpful way for a beginning student to think about Greek verbs. Okay. In fact, he could have given it to you back in chapter 2 and 3. It was there. He just didn't introduce it to you because he probably didn't want to confuse. I've never asked him why he waits till this chapter, but he waits till you get another tense. And then he goes, okay, let's think about these verb systems and how they're constructed a little bit. So he gives you 6 boxes, and I've kind of rewritten the chart here a little bit differently. There are 6 boxes, and here's what he's communicating with this table 13.1. In the Greek verb system, there are 6 possibilities, and that's the key word, possibilities. All Greek tenses will not use all 6 boxes, but it has 6. The Greek verb system, the Greek verb has 6 potential, and the way it's formed in its various principal parts has 6 potential or 6 boxes to its morphology. Okay, so let me run through them. Here's the ones you're most familiar with. You're familiar with number 3 box, and he gives you the names there on chart 13.1. I didn't write that down. That's the tense stem. We've learned that as the lexical form. So this was part of chapter 2 and 3. You just didn't learn it this way, is all I'm saying. When you learn present active indicative, you learn that there's a tense stem with a thematic vowel and an ending. So you are familiar with 3 out of these 6 boxes from present tense. Number 3 is the this tense stem, or the lexical form that you're familiar with. Number 5 box you see there in chart table 13.1 is the thematic vowel. Remember, thematic vowel is that vowel that connects the ending with the stem. And you learned in the previous chapter, in chapter 12, that if you have a contract verb, that's verbs that their stem ends with an O-E or A. When it comes into contact with that thematic vowel, it's going to volatilize and usually lengthen or change. Okay, so you've been introduced to the thematic vowel. Some of you have learned the endings O-A-S-E, O-M-N-A-T-U-S-E with some of the with the thematic vowels attached. Okay, now number 6 box is the endings, and you learned in the present tense 2 sets of endings: an active set of endings in the first, second, third, singular, plural. Remember O-A-S-E, O-M-N-A-T-U-S-E, and you learn the middle passive endings. That's the 6 box: my, a time, and stay, un time. Okay, so this is going to, by the way, let me say also 3 new boxes you're getting introduced to. The number 1 box you didn't see with the present tense, didn't use it. So you didn't have this as a part of the present tense, but you have it with the imperfect. It's called the augment. It's a letter that's added to the front of the stem. I'll get to that in a second. The number 2 box is reduplication, and noticed in table 13.1, it's kind of blanked out a little bit, and I have it empty up here on the board because the imperfect, you didn't hear about reduplication in the present tense, chapter 2 and 3, because the present tense doesn't use it. And here he's got it blanked out because the imperfect tense doesn't use it. So not all tenses are going to use all 6 boxes. Okay, so some tense, like the perfect you'll get to later, will use reduplication. The 4th box, which is also a new box, is called the tense suffix. Again, blanked out with the imperfect because the imperfect tense doesn't use it. You haven't heard it up to now because neither does the present tense use it. Aorist tense and some others are going to use that. So these are the 6 parts of a Greek verb construction or morphology. In which boxes does present tense use? Think about it again from chapter 2 and 3. The answer is number 3, number 5, number 6. That's what the present tense uses. What boxes does the imperfect tense? Well, you're going to get introduced to the number 1 box. So it uses the 3, the 5, and the 6, though it's going to have a different ending set. I'll get to that in a second. But it's going to use a box the present tense then uses, which is the augment. And the augment gives it its time as past time. Whenever you see an augment on a verb, it means it's past time. So notice what, because the imperfect tense is a first principle part, it uses the same tense as the same tense stem. It uses the same stem as the present tense. Let me say that again. But it adds a time, past time component, which is the augment. Augment tells you past time. So when I see past augment added to a tense stem, present tense stem, I know I've got an imperfect. Now think of it this way. Every tense has its own fingerprint markers for how it's constructed. With the imperfect tense, you have 2 telltale fingerprints, 2 identity markers, 2 things that it utilizes. When you see these 2 things, you're going to go, oh, I've got an imperfect. Okay, you're going to its 2 are the augment, make it unique. It has the augment. And it has a second thing, and it must have both. The second thing is it has a unique what we call secondary endings. You learn the primary endings, OSA, and then edusi, in chapter 2 and 3. In this chapter, you're going to learn what we call the secondary endings that go with these past tenses in the Greek language. So the imperfect has 2 identity markers. It has the augment in box 1. And it has the secondary endings. I'll get to that in a second. Let's talk about the augment. The augment, which he talks about on page 192, 193, and following, is an E, an epsilon, that gets added to the stem. Now, whenever the stem, what everything on page 193 is telling you is to, hey, watch out, because sometimes if your stem has a vowel on front of it, you can have some changes. Now, take this verb right here. If I were to write that out, this is how it would look. And if I were to parse this or locate this, it would be imperfect active, indicative, first person singular. Now, notice it has its formulated parts, it has its fingerprints. It has its augment on the front, and it has its secondary endings, which I'll talk about in a minute, its ending pattern. It doesn't have OSA, it has a different set. Those are the 2 fingerprints. That's what identifies it as imperfect. Here's the thing. He's trying to tell you on page 193. If you take an augment and you add it to, say, something like a lambda here, most of your verbs are going to have a consonant letter at the front. No problem. You see the augment on the front. If you've learned this verb luo, you're going to see the augment and go, oh, there I've got an augment. That you're going to see the epsilon and go, I have an augment. What he's basically telling you in 193 is there are some verbs that have vowels at the front, and when they have vowels at the front, that E is going to get added to that vowel, and it's going to change, kind of like a contract verb in this sense. Some letters, they just don't play nice together, and one gobbles up the other, they contract or they lengthen or something to that effect. Here, an E and an A come together, this is what it'll look like. You won't see this on the front of a verb, in the sense if you add an augment to it. These 2 are going to come together, and it's going to change to an eta. Let's say this is the stem for estio, to eat. So if I add an augment, because I want to make that imperfect, those 2 are going to combine and make an eta. This is how it's going to look in the text. You're not going to see 2 E's. The 2 E's come together and they say an eta. Let's say you have a verb, and these are examples right off the page there, that has an omicron at the beginning. When I add that augment to it, these 2 they're volatile. They're going to come together and lengthen to an omega. Okay, so he gives you a number of examples. I didn't go through all of them, but you look at the page 193 and 194. He gives you a number of examples just basically to say, hey, you learn a vocabulary word. If it has a verb on the front and you add that augment, just recognize that it's going to change. And he wants you to know that because you might get tripped up. You might see this in the text and not be able to locate it. You have to know that you have to have memorized it as this with that omicron, so that when you see this with the omega, you know, oh, the augment's hiding there. The augment came together with that omicron and created omega, and you'll correctly locate it as imperfect. The other thing he's going to show you on, I think it's on page 194, is also keep in mind that anytime you learn this with prepositions, a preposition can go right on to a verb. They can combine. You can have combinations where you have a preposition right on the front of a verb. Okay? and it often changes the meaning of the verb. We learned that in a previous chapter. He says, well, when you have an augment, when you add an augment to a verb that has a preposition attached to it, the augment always goes after the preposition, never before. And that will trip you up if you don't know that. You may miss that. It's there. It's not high. It's hiding. It'll be there in the text, but you may not recognize it if you don't know that's a preposition and that's the verb stem. It'll come in between them. Okay, so that's everything on page 193, 194. That's basically, and he says there on the key on page 194, compounds will hide augments. Okay, that's all he's saying. Compounds will hide, and put in quotes, hide. It's not hiding. It's right there. It'll be in the text. You just may not see it because you're not thinking about it. It comes after the preposition. Okay. So he's going to talk about the other aspect, thematic vowel, the O and the E, and he's going to say sometimes you're going to have contract verbs. So if you have contract verbs, you're going to have the same problem in the imperfect tense that you had in the present. If a contracted verb ends in O-E-A, you're going to have problems when that thematic vowel comes together. That's going to be a part of the verb system as a whole. And here's the ending. Let's talk about endings, page 195. Here's another new thing. So you learn to augment. You'll also learn on page 195 in chart or table 13.2 that you have a different set of endings. They call them secondary endings. When you have secondary tenses, these are past tenses in the Greek, which is the imperfect is one of them. You're going to have secondary endings. So secondary tenses take secondary endings. What are secondary endings? That chart, table 13.2. You just have to learn that chart. Like you learned o, ace, a, omen, enti, usi, my, et, time, and stay in time, you need to learn this one. This is the secondary set of endings. Here's the good news. This is the only other set of endings for the tense systems. They're all going to use either the primary or the secondary. Okay, all the verb tenses are going to use one of those two. Okay, so you got to learn these and learn these as a chart. Nu sigma nun, none, and he explains all this in detail in the verbiage below. None, which oftentimes shows up he puts in parentheses, epsilon nu. I'm just going through table 13.2. The nu, the sigma, the none, which is two dashes mean, sometimes showing up as epsilon nu. The men, te, nu, or san. Learn both of those. You'll want to learn the nu and the san there, because the san is very common and will pop up oftentimes. So the nu is the most common. And then you see the chart. You have men. You have the u. These are the middle passive. Men unta, met the state unta. Okay. Oh, messed it up. Unta. Now this is the same chart pattern. This is the middle passive of the secondary ending. Same chart pattern you saw with the present. This is your first person singular. This is your second person singular. Third singular. First plural. Second plural. Third plural. It's the same pattern as your previous one. It's just different endings, secondary endings. Okay, so you learn that chart, and you got page 195, so that you can rightly, when you see one of these endings, if you see this on the end of a verb, you know you have first person plural, middle passive. Okay, that's the point. Now, just to make it easy, if you flip to page 196 in table 13.3, he gives you both charts right there. Tag this book. Dog earmark this book. Earmark this book, because that right there, the primary, secondary endings, those are the two charts you need to know. All your verb tenses are going to have one of those two chart endings. If they're active, they're going to have, in their primary tense, they're going to have primary actives. If they're active in their secondary tense, they're going to have secondary actives. Okay, so know those two charts. Everything on 197 is just examples. He's just giving you examples of everything you just learned. So he gives you the luo verb in its imperfect active, worked out, luon, lues, lue, luomen. I'm just going down chart in table 13.4. Luete, luon. Okay, so take elu. I'll do this one. Elu ete. Take elu ete. If I said locate this, you see the two. You see your stem here. You see your thematic vowel. You see your augment, and you see your secondary ending, and you can locate that. And so you would know you have an augment with a secondary. If you've memorized your endings, you have a secondary ending here. So you have imperfect. You have active, and you have a second person plural. It's down, well, those are the middle passive, second person plural, if you look at your chart, okay? So that's what we mean, that he's just giving you the examples, okay, of where those worked out with the luo verb. And then he's giving you contract verb examples in table 13.6. That's nothing new. Table 13.6 and 13.7 is just chapter 12. It's just chapter 12 saying, okay, here's what contract verbs look like in an imperfect tense. They're adding the augment and they're adding the secondary endings. That's it. You still have the same issue with the contract verbs, with the thematic vowel that you had before. Page 198, you're going to need to know the emmy, the imperfect of emmy. You get in table 13.8, the imperfect indicative of emmy. Remember, emmy verbs, copulative being verbs, do not have voice. They're just present indicative or imperfect indicative, whatever. They're not active, middle, passive. So there's just one form to learn. And he makes a suggestion, 13.8, kind of like you learn the present of emmy, I am, you are, we, he, she, or it is. Learn it as vocabulary words, probably the best way to think about it. Don't think about it as a paradigm. I would make these 6 words vocabulary cards and just learn them as vocabulary words. 13.8, I'm talking about those 6 verbs there. So main is the first one, is I was. Ace is you were. Ain, the third one down, is he, she, or it was, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now on page 199 and 200, he's going to introduce you to nuances of the imperfect language in the imperfect tense. And you're going to get this with every tense. Here's the thing. This is not about morphology. Page 199 and 200 is about translation. Okay, here's the fun part about Greek. You're getting into interpretation a little bit. So just because a verb is, say, in the present tense or in the imperfect tense doesn't mean it's translated the same way every single time. There's a default way. I was going, for example, imperfect. But he says, and he begins to introduce you to a handful of nuanced translations. And he introduces you to 3 of them, the inceptive imperfect, cognitive imperfect, and the customary imperfect. Just read through those. They're really self-explanatory. Here's what you need to know about those. These are not different spelling changes. In other words, these types of imperfects are going to look like imperfects. They're going to be constructed just like this. He's not talking about morphology or spelling change on page 199. He's talking about a nuance of translation. And so you go, wait a minute, if an inceptive imperfect looks exactly the same as a cognitive imperfect, they're going to be morphed. The morphology is going to look exactly the same. How do I know which one is which? And the answer is context. The only way to know is context. And he's trying to begin to introduce you to the subtleties, the real nuances that come with translation. And you only pick that up through skill over time of dealing with a text over and over again, or looking for clues in the surrounding text. So if you just have a verb, there's no way to know if it's an inceptive, cognitive, customary, if you just have the verb by itself. You need context in order to make one of those things, one of those 3, for example, nuances possible. All right, so that's the verb system. The imperfect tense of the verb system. And he introduces you on page 200 to imperfect deponents. You've read deponents before. Again, that's nothing new. He's talked about that before. It's the same deal. So you just want to work through your exercises in exercise 13. And make sure to note on page 205, you have some new vocabulary words. And he has some vocabulary notes on the bottom of page 205. All right, that's the imperfect tense.